circumcision cuts through us all, that everybody in the orbit of a circumcised man is affected. The perpetrator, the parents who signed off on it, the boy and the man he'll become, siblings, sex partners, friends. It's such a traumatic and everlasting thing to do to a child that everybody in that child's life is potentially involved and impacted by it.
The Intact Again podcast is an oral history project where we share stories from those who have been circumcised and are working to restore what was taken from us. Our hope is to inspire each other with our collective stories of loss and recovery.
Just in time for National Foreskin Day, an annual celebration each April 4th, today's guest is the Executive Director of Intact America, Georgianne Chapin. She has written a book entitled This Penis Business, in which she shares a story of how circumcision impacted her life and her family, and why she is motivated to end this practice. It's a fascinating and tragic story, but she's hopeful for the future. Stay tuned until the end, where she offers advice on how we in the restoring community can help in this practice of routine infant circumcision. You've written this quite good book. I've read it twice, This Penis Business. Could you tell us what this book is about?
It's a memoir. This Penis Business, as the subtitle, is a social activist memoir. And it was written because I love to write and I like to reflect on things that I've done and things going on in the world. But so many people asked me over the years, how did you get into this penis business? Why do you care? You're a woman, you don't have a penis. What's the difference? Whether you're circumcised, you're not circumcised, why is it an issue? And why are you spending all this time on this unimportant issue? I always felt like it was of critical importance, and I was able to trace my interest in the topic back to the first time I was aware of even the word, and that was when my brother came home from the hospital, and I was 10, and he was a newborn, and I saw his bloody penis, and I asked about it, and I was told that it was circumcision, and then a few days later, he had to be taken back to have the hole in his urethra reopened, and I didn't know at the time, nobody knew at the time. That is a complication that only occurs in boys or men who have been circumcised. It can happen much later in life. It can happen in infancy. It's extremely serious. If it happens to a baby can die if he can't urinate. So the pieces kept falling into place over the years. So it's not like I had this full understanding of what circumcision did, what it even was when I was 10 years old. But what I did have an understanding of was how weird it was to take a normal newborn child and remove part of his body. It made no sense to me, never made any sense to me. And then as I got older, every time I would come across something that would make me think about it, whether it was, as I became sexually active, as I would hear anecdotes, I'd hear jokes. And then when, in the early 70s, when I was in college, people started talking about female genital mutilation. And I remember my very first reaction was, well, we do that to boys. How are we so exercised about this being done to girls? And we blithely and happily and automatically chop off part of newborn boys' penises. It just made no sense to me. As I got older, I had an undergraduate degree in anthropology and graduate degree in public health. So I worked in the health field, social sciences. And then I went to law school when I was midlife. When I was 47, I enrolled in law school, essentially just to do something different. I kept my job. I was a president and CEO of a nonprofit health plan. I kept the job. And when I went to law school, I said, something's going to come of it. I'm not really sure what. And right before I started law school, my son had thanked me for not having him circumcised. I tell that story at the beginning of my book. And I just got everything that I learned, everything I did in law school just kept bringing me back to this topic. So, you study constitutional law, that's required, torts, criminal law, and circumcision stood out as this screaming exception to all of the laws against stealing somebody's organs, violating their bodily autonomy, doing no harm. Here you are harming almost half of the population at birth, and it just was so astonishing to me. You could get refugee status if you were a woman, but there was no such thing for a man. I mean, no man ever turned up, at the border saying they're going to try and circumcise me and I want to get asylum. I mean, American judges just shrug their shoulders. Well, it's good enough for me. It's good enough for you. It's such a crazy exception. After I got my law degree, I taught bioethics and I read a lot. I read a lot of memoirs, and I started thinking that telling the story of my life and how I got into this topic was an explanation, and it also might be interesting. People like to hear about other people's lives, especially if it's told in a frank and entertaining way. So that's what I did. And the first half of the book approximately is really autobiographical, and I talk about different things that occurred to me that made me think about circumcision and, how it kept coming up. And then the last third to half of the book is really about the medical industry and how it exploits women by getting them to sign off on circumcising their babies, and how it exploits baby boys and the men they'll become, and really all of us by association. So the book, again, is called This Penis Business, a social activist memoir. It's available everywhere books are sold, and it's available in audio format, in ebook format. And I just released, just now, I mean, I haven't even publicized it, a new version that has photos. A number of my friends complained to me that I didn't put any photos in the first book, and I didn't, not because I was trying to be coy, but because it's under a deadline and I just didn't have time. So we've gone back and I've curated a bunch of photos over my lifetime and put them in the book. So it's kind of exciting.
When it came to the book, what surprised you the most when you're researching both the topic of circumcision and like researching your life? Because I remember you talking in the epilogue about talking to family members and just trying to piece together what happened when, and all that.
Well, life evolves, right? And you get into something, you believe it, you kind of take for granted your belief in it. It wasn't exactly in writing the book, it was in the time since leading Intact America. When I got involved in the movement when I was still in law school, way before I started writing the book. In 2003, I met a number of other intactivists and people leading very small organizations. And then I met a donor, Marilyn Milos, who also wrote a book called Please Don't Cut the Baby, a memoir of her own. It was published last February. Excellent book. She introduced me to a donor, and we went through planning session and decided to start Intact America. And I was all for the idea, but I never expected to be asked to lead the organization. I was sort of left looking around the table and everybody's looking at me. During that process, and then in the early years of leading Intact America, I was really taken aback by the degree of trauma and grief and rage that circumcised men were experiencing. And unlike the judges and other people who want to write this off, I felt it very deeply. Men feel safe talking to me about sexual issues, and I think it's because I'm older. That is definitely part of it. It's also that there are just so few people who are willing to listen and talk non-judgmentally about this. There's still such a fear for men to reveal their feelings about having been mutilated when they were little babies, right? And how does it feel to be the first person someone's felt comfortable talking about the damage that was done to them? I will say that men also talk to me about other things, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an expert counselor, but just by putting myself out there. So men have told me they are gay and that I'm the first person they've ever told that to. And I'm talking about, men in their 30s, 40s. Obviously, this is all tied up in sexual identity. And I am comfortable hearing these questions, these stories, these statements. I feel really privileged, and I feel thankful that they feel that finally they can tell somebody these things, because that breaks a barrier, right? And then the other thing is I feel a very heavy sense of responsibility, because you can't play around with people's feelings. You can't play around with people's confidences. It does keep me up at night sometimes to have heard these stories. One story that stuck with me, I talk about it in my book, was a man who called me, and his wife was pregnant. They had a 3-year-old daughter, and his wife was, or 2-year-old daughter, the wife was pregnant, and it was a boy, and she was insisting that they circumcise him. And he was in despair. He was cut, he was circumcised, and he was in despair over this. And he was trying to figure out how to make it not happen, and also trying to figure out whether he could live with his wife if she insisted on it. And it was just the most tragic situation. And I gave him a few ideas, but all I could really do was listen, because he was in a terrible dilemma. Because she said she would divorce him if he didn't allow the baby to be circumcised. What a horrible thing to face. So, that kept me up for about a year. I had 2 phone calls with him, and I never heard from him again, so I don't know what happened. I suspect the child was cut, and I suspect the couple is not together, but I'm just making that up. I don't have any idea. I always appreciated that this was a very violent surgery done to a newborn baby for no medical reason and for decades without any anesthesia. The stories I was hearing about flashbacks, night terror, incapacitating grief, rage, I never once doubted their genuine origin in this brutal surgery that these men had experienced when they were a few hours old. We would never doubt the story of a woman who, as an infant girl, was raped, or whose hymen was cut open with a knife. We would appreciate the violence of that, and we would never say, "Well, she won't remember it, so big deal." But with boys, we would write that off, and boys are expected to not feel things. They're expected to just suck it up, whatever it is. And then that has repercussions throughout one's lifetime and throughout one's relationship. So that takes us back to the ultimate interpersonal problems that circumcision causes later in life, especially in sexual relationships and in parent-child relationships also. The betrayal by one's parents, even though it's not conscious betrayal, usually. It just was something that I just kept running into. And then also parents talk to me, mothers, couples. I'll get a call from one or another party in a couple, and there's this huge elephant and the huge, massive misunderstanding between partners that the man is callous and unfeeling because he wants the boy circumcised, and the female partner often doesn't realize that her male lover or husband or boyfriend is probably thinking that she thinks there's something wrong with him. And, it's sometimes the basis of a conversation that can go forward. So it's an extremely heavy burden that we bear as Americans.
What would you say are the problems caused for the other partner in the relationship?
The problems that circumcision causes by the other partner in a sexual relationship come from the fact that the circumcised man does not have a complete penis. He has had part of his sex organ removed, and the part that's been removed is highly sensitive and functional. It's got nerves and muscles. It protects the glands, the head of the penis, keeps it soft and moist. And during intercourse or foreplay or any kind of intimate sexual activity, the gliding action of the foreskin is a source of immense pleasure for both partners. So I believe that there's a lot of sexual unhappiness in the US, and I'll speak from a heterosexual perspective. I think that women and men are often at odds sexually because women believe that their male partners are not sensitive and are not taking their needs into account. And that might be true, and it is likely not to be the man's fault. He doesn't have what nature meant him to have that would be the key to the full sexual experience. It's a very depressing fact. However, restoration can go a long way toward restoring to some degree the protective function of the foreskin and the gliding motion and just a feeling of well-being by having your penis look more natural than a circumcised penis. So I really understand. I mean, why do women restore their breasts after breast removal? Because it makes them feel literally complete, right? Now, a restored breast is probably not as sensitive as a pre-surgery breast with its nipple all connected to all those nerves, but it looks proper and gives its owner a sense of well-being that the scar and the mutilation detract from. You asked me if some of the men who are speaking out about what was done to them, if they're restoring. I don't usually ask because there are people who feel that it's very personal, but I know some are restoring. And I also know that many of the men I know who are active in the movement have restored or have attempted restoration and then decided it really wasn't necessary for them to do that. For some men, it's just too difficult and was going to take such a long time that they said, you know what, I kind of gone through the process. It did make me feel better that I could do this, and I don't need to do that. Yes, it makes most men feel better about themselves. They restore, if they're able to achieve even a modicum restoration of function and sensation, that is great. It gives somebody something to do, right? You can do something about it, which is always important. If you have something that happened in your life that caused you grief, if you have an illness, there's nothing worse than being told, oh, it's a lost cause. You can't do anything about it. And I think there are two ways that men who are unhappy with their circumcisions can get some satisfaction. And one is talking about it. And we go back, I said that before, talking to people, talking to your peers, talking to people in your community, talking to parents, talking to siblings. Obviously not if that makes you unhappy, but looking for ways to talk about it. And the other is to take proactive measures, shop for the restoration equipment, give it a try, talk to the people who have invented these techniques and these devices, talk to them about it. They're going to be your sympathetic ear and can help you to regain a feeling of wholeness. So that's just super important. And I'm glad to see that there's a proliferation of restoration devices now. And someday, probably they'll be commercialized at a larger scale. I think they're still mostly cottage industry, people making them in very small workshops, but it's a great thing. I know a couple of men who did surgical restoration, and that is still extremely difficult and mostly unsuccessful. Hopefully, there will be techniques that will be better in the future, but right now, the manual stretching is the way to go and very satisfactory in many cases.
You tell a very personal story in your book about your brother Chip that was unsatisfied with being circumcised. If you feel comfortable talking about, do you think restoration could have helped him?
My brother had a lot of mental problems and physical problems, and we never talked about it as adults. I know that he didn't like being circumcised because he told our father, my brother Chip and I never discussed it. He knew about the work I was doing. He died in 2014, and he was pretty compromised mentally for the last few years of his life. So he didn't bring it up to me, and I didn't feel that comfortable bringing it up to him. My observations of him started when he was a tiny infant and he came home so traumatized. And most of the pictures of him in his childhood were of a very sad child. 2 unanesthetized surgeries in the first 5 days of his life. I did talk to my mother's second husband who raised me. I talked to him about it, and he told me that they were never asked and Chip was just taken away and brought back circumcised, and that absolutely makes sense. It was early '60s, 1962 he was born, and they hadn't even started asking for any kind of cursory consent. My mother was knocked out when he was born. Things started to change, in the '70s, but it was something that my father regretted terribly, but had been, and according to him, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, 'cause he's intact. I would have chosen to keep Chip intact. It was never brought up. He was young. It was his first, natural child. I don't think it was even on his radar, and I'm sure it wasn't on my mother's radar either. So I never blamed them for it. I was more curious as to how it occurred, and then since then I've heard hundreds of stories from mothers and fathers who had children in that period of time, the '50s and '60s, and it was a very typical story.
What advice would you have for kids wanting to ask their parents why they were mutilated? And what advice do you have for parents wanting to talk to their children about what happened?
Well, for for kids or men, young men, old, wanting to talk to their parents, that's such a fraught conversation. Ideally, they would just be able to talk to their parents and say, "Why did that happen?" But parents can be on the defensive. The question can be asked in a very assaultive manner, understandably. It's kind of taboo topic in our culture, so it's not taboo to do it to a baby, we do it with impunity, but then we don't wanna talk about it. So, it really depends on the relationship a lot, and some people do get over it, but a lot of people get really hung up in that conversation, and the parent doesn't want to go into it. There've been more successful, I think, conversations I've had with parents who want to apologize to their children and raise it for that reason. A lot of it just depends on people's interpersonal relationships, right? That are outside this topic. But it changes over time, right? So there's one young man who I'm in touch with who's from St. Louis. And when we first started talking, he had not been able to talk to his father about it. And he was very intent on collecting all the medical evidence against circumcision and presenting it to the people that he knew, and he felt like he didn't have a right to have a conversation without having all the medical facts. The medical facts are mostly BS, right? But he felt like to be credible, he had to master the science of the topic, and we were having a conversation probably a couple of years after we had started talking, and I said, I really don't think you need to have all the medical facts to tell people how you feel about having had this essential part of your body cut off. And as I was saying this, he just burst into the conversation. He said, "I just really want to talk to my father." And it's like, yeah, I get it, So hopefully you can do that. Tell him, "I really want to talk to you about this. I don't want to yell at you." I've talked to people who have had spectacularly terrible results trying to talk to their parents. And I've talked to people who've had a process that ended up in understanding and some healing. Or, okay, this ain't going to work. Forget it. I'll never talk to you again about this. I mean, that could happen too. One case where a man who I'd been in touch with for a long time and who was traumatized about having been circumcised and who had never talked to his father about it because he didn't have a good relationship with his father. And then this man tried to take his own life. So his father was in the hospital with him, and thankfully the young man survived. he had his father call me because I think he thought he was going to pass away, and he thought that he wanted, I don't know, he wanted his father to know that what his will was, in terms financially, I guess. So I ended up talking to the father of this guy who had told me that his father was completely unapproachable, and pick up the phone, and there's his father on the line. And his father said to me, he never told me that he hated being circumcised. I said, well, yeah, Intact America is, an organization that has tens of thousands of men as our community who hate being circumcised. He's not alone. And the conversation didn't really go much beyond that. And thankfully, the younger man recovered. But that's an example of just how fraught the conversation was. And I don't know if they ever had a follow-up. Not that I know of, but I know I put the father on the Intact America mailing list with his permission, and I fully expect that somewhere down the line I'll hear more about this family. People come back after many years.
That brings me to something else I want to ask about, just the families that are torn apart either through divorce or just the death of the child. That's something that is largely covered up.
Right. It's covered up by the medical establishment. There's no cause of death circumcision. It's exsanguination, which is bleeding, cardiac arrest, heart attack from the trauma.
Anesthesia.
Yeah. So no one's ever died from circumcision. If you look at medical records, they've died from all this other stuff that were caused by the circumcision. That would never have occurred if it wasn't for that. I can't even imagine what that must be like for a parent. There are groups that on Facebook that kind of keep an eye on these posts from parents whose babies either almost died or, were in intensive care following the circumcision, or who did die. I don't go looking for them. They're so sad and depressing. But what I have seen when they pop up on another Intactivist page is he's with the angels now. God wanted to take him. It's just the most crazy stuff. But the alternative, I guess, is for the parent to take responsibility for signing off on it and for the doctor to take responsibility for the death. And there's an enormous resistance to that.
What is the dumbest reason you've heard as an argument for circumcision?
They're all dumb. There are no smart reasons to cut off a natural, normal part of a baby boy's body. Some of the dumbest things I've heard is, oh, he won't remember it. Babies don't feel pain. He'll thank me for it later. I've never, ever heard a man who understands what was done to him say, I'm so thankful that somebody tied me down and sliced off part of my body when I was a baby. Just such stupid stuff. I have talked to mothers of men who've killed themselves later in life, and the guilt over having allowed their son to be circumcised will never go away. And interestingly, the mothers, I think, suffer from that more than anybody else. So yeah, it's a terrible thing. And I know marriages have broken up. I know many marriages that have foundered on this. Because if you think about it, I want to protect my baby, whether I'm a father or a mother, and my partner is saying, tie him down and cut off part of his body. That's what they're saying, right? So where's the compassion in your partner? And if they don't care that you are suffering from this decision and they're not willing to listen to you, the other parent, or they're not willing to think about, more importantly, the baby and have compassion for the baby who's going to be wounded. And so is this somebody you really want to spend your life with? And people make all kinds of compromises. And this to me is one of the most tragic compromises that we ask parents to make every day in America. The good news is people are talking about it. People do change their minds in pregnancy. I've encouraged partners to say to the partner who wants to circumcise, please, let's just hold off on it. Can you see how intensely I feel about this? Just let's give it a break. Can we discuss this later? Can we just get the baby home and see if we like him the way he is? Or really put their foot down. I've seen parents, put up notes on the bassinet in the hospital, no circumcision, even though the other parent doesn't approve. There are ways of fighting it, but it shouldn't have to be a fight. It shouldn't have to be a fight that then, 25 years down the line, some man has to try to restore what he should have never lost.
This book fits into a larger strategy for Intact America. How would you describe the impact it's had so far?
Well, people who I know are very thrilled that I took the time to write it, and they learn more about my life. People who I don't know who have written, and most of them say, I never knew how deep a topic this was. I never understood it, or I didn't know all the details, and it's great. It's so good to hear how one person became involved, all of the things that happen with memoir. But I believe the biggest impact this book has is that it can get people to talk about this problem. And your group, of restoring men, they're talking to each other, and that's really important. But this is not something that any boy or man needs to be ashamed of. Why is a boy who was tied down when he was 8 hours old and his penis was cut, why is this a shameful thing for him to talk about? We must talk about it. And if we don't talk about it, things will never change. So that is my hope, that this book will have an impact. It will be embraced by people who are curious, who are concerned, and who can use it even as a way of saying, like, maybe they're not going to approach a family member, a neighbor or something and say, I want to talk to you about circumcision. I want to talk to you how I feel about this. But maybe they can say, I read this interesting book by a woman, she's in her 70s, she's a lawyer, and she talks about how she became involved in this topic. Whatever it takes to get people to speak out, that's what I'm interested in. And, I spent 4 years writing that book, and my fervent hope was that it would open up many, 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 many questions and conversations. And I think it's been successful, maybe to the many, and I want many, many more, right? So my feeling is it's out there. It's very readable. Marilyn Milas's book is also very readable. Both of us have had sort of interesting lives, but at the end of the book, I make a plea for people to talk about this topic. It's really important.
Speaking of pleas, what can us and the restoring community do to help Intact America and its mission?
You can talk about it, talk about the organization, talk about the issue. You can tell people to read my book. You can buy my book. You can donate to Intact America or to another intactivist organization that speaks to you. I mean, of course, I hope you donate to Intact America. Most of our donors are men. The vast majority of our donors are men. And it's the most important thing is to refuse to be intimidated. It doesn't need to be a secret. I mean, again, going back to the analogy of breast removal, women used to be embarrassed by mastectomy scars, and now they feel that they have a right to demand restoration. Insurance should cover foreskin restoration. It absolutely should. Unfortunately, it doesn't have standard equipment and all of that. I mean, I say unfortunately, I think it's great that people are taking matters to their own ingenuity, their own hands, but probably get all corrupted if it gets adopted by the medical profession and you develop a code for foreskin restoration. But if women can have breast restoration after surgeries that they've consented to, or if you could have a vasectomy reversed, why on earth are men not able to get resources to restore their foreskins? And the men restoring their foreskins are walking examples of why circumcision should not be done to a baby. Yeah, they should be proud that they are willing to do something about it and willing to speak out about it. And, you start small, I guess you start speaking out among your close friends, but it gets easier and easier to speak out. I mean, there's nobody who I won't talk to about this. And I was a little intimidated back in the day, but there's nothing to be intimidated about.
If you had a 30-second Super Bowl ad, what would this ad be like?
You could do a lot in 30 seconds, but I would probably use various phrases and imagery. One is 10 out of 10 babies say no to circumcision. Another is nobody wants less penis. And I think that's a really important bottom line in any speaking out, because you are reducing the size and function of a baby's penis, and that will last for a lifetime. The other is we have a slogan, which is circumcision cuts through us all, and it does. Think about it. Think before you cut. Will your baby thank you? No baby ever thanked anybody for circumcising him. All of these phrases come to mind, how it would be produced and what images would be used. I would definitely not consider myself an expert on that, but I really believe that this is something that can be broken into the public space, whether it's an ad on the side of a bus or a Super Bowl ad. So those are some of my thoughts about that. And we always, are looking for that magic bullet, but it's a very complex topic and people can weasel around it. So you need multitude of messages and a multitude of images and analogies to be
It's
successful.
it's like what you said, if people acted rationally, it wouldn't have started in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. Common sense. People say, do your research. Do your research. It's like, no, don't do your research. There's so much research out there that's such crap, right? Use your common sense. You have a perfect, beautiful, newborn child. He's going to be born, which is traumatic because it's, there's a lot of pressure involved. And then he comes into the world and you should be holding him and loving him and not handing him over to some stranger who's going to take off all of his clothes, strap him down to a plastic board, and saw off part of his penis. How much research do you need to do to know that that makes no sense? It's hard for people to hear, but if you can't hear it, then you shouldn't do it.
But what's coming up at 2025 and beyond?
We have a couple of really big events coming up this spring of 2025. The first one is on April 4th, 4/4, and that will be the third annual Foreskin Day that Intact America produces. It's got a live component. It's got a host. We have a really cool host this year, Martin Morrow. He's a comedian. We do person on the street interviews with, certain questions. It's a lot of fun. The theme for this year's Foreskin Day is foreskin is the first line of defense, because nurses learn that skin is the first line of defense. And the foreskin, above all in a newborn, serves to protect the rest of the penis. So that's the theme for Foreskin Day. Then the end of April, we have an incredibly cool event in New York City where we will be presenting the actor and author and incomparably awesome performer Alan Cumming with the inaugural Skin in the Game Award. Skin in the Game is a campaign we have that is a photo and storytelling campaign. You can go to our website for Skin in the Game, skinofthegame.org. You could go to Intact America's website, intactamerica.org. Alan Cumming will be receiving the inaugural Skin in the Game Award as someone who has been unflinchingly willing to talk about this issue and absolutely opposed to non-consensual circumcision of anybody who has not consented. So we're very, very excited about that. It's a fundraiser for Intact America, and it's going to be a really beautiful event in New York City at Poster House. And tickets will go on sale in early March. Go to the event page on intactamerica.org or go to skinинthegame.org and find out more details about the gala.
And that brings up another website, the Do No Harm project you talked about in the
Yes,
book.
thank you for asking me about that. We have these other two spring events, so Do No Harm is not foremost in my mind now, but it's an incredibly good campaign and a good project that Intact America has launched. Do No Harm Report is a database that we developed for people to register complaints about penile injuries. So circumcision, forcible foreskin retraction, anything that others, but mostly it's doctors, have done to baby boys to wound their foreskins, to injure their foreskins. And right now, the site is set up only to take complaints in Georgia, and we're going to be rolling it out for the rest of the states. But we've put it on hold for a little bit while we have a fundraiser up on GoFundMe for Do No Harm Report. But ultimately, it will take reports from people, mothers, men who've been cut, and we will forward those reports to the state regulatory agencies that exercise oversight over physicians or other clinicians. These are not lawsuits. We don't do lawsuits. Lawsuits are cumbersome and not a wide-scale solution to anything. So it's really to hold the doctors accountable for the damage they caused by reporting them to the state and hold the states accountable for following up. And I would think it will probably get rolling seriously in this coming year, in 2026.
That's fantastic because one of the big things that people complain about, and rightfully so, is that no one listens. And
Right.
with this, somebody will actually listen.
Will be held accountable for listening, right. And I should say that when we started it out, Intact America does research. We do surveys. We had surveys on forcible foreskin retraction where we found that 42% of babies under the age of, four, I believe. You can go on our website and look it up, forcible foreskin retraction or forced foreskin retraction. And 42% have had their foreskins forcibly retracted, almost in every case by a nurse or doctor or by a parent who's been instructed to do that by a nurse or doctor. And for an intact child, that is as traumatic as a circumcision because the foreskin, if it's not naturally retracted, is attached to the head of the penis, and forcible retraction breaks that tissue, causes bleeding, can cause infection, and causes excruciating pain. So initially it was for circumcision harm, which is any circumcision complications, which are far more frequent than reported, and forcible retraction. We decided about halfway through developing the software that we would take complaints from people of any age. So if you're 47 years old and you know the hospital you were circumcised in and you know the name of the doctor, even if you don't know all of that, but you can file a report and we will take it to state authorities. I guess if you don't know the hospital, it makes it harder for there to be any follow-up. But I have been surprised at how many men have told me they know the identity of the doctor who circumcised them. In many cases, it was the mother's obstetrician. In some cases, it was the pediatrician. And they want that physician to be held accountable, if in no other way than just having to listen to them talk about it.
That's really cool.
It's really exciting, actually. Very cumbersome, for people to report on medical malpractice, medical complications and all that. And that's why people, want to go to a lawyer and they think they're going to get a bang-up case. And it's very expensive, very time-consuming, and most lawyers will not take a case if it's not going to bring in a significant amount of money. They just can't. So this is a way of giving people a place to speak out. And of course, we will collect many stories. If you look at intactamerica.org and skininthegame.org, you'll find many, many stories from circumcision survivors, from other people in their, families. And this is a way of people feeling that they're doing something by speaking out, right? And by complaining.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Again, I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of your listeners for listening to this and also for taking it upon themselves to do something about this thing that happened to them when they had no control over it. And I wish everybody in the restoring community only the best results and happiness.
And speaking of happiness, this is Open Roads, and I want to jump in here to let you know that we've broken yet another goal. Intact Again podcast episodes have been downloaded more than 10,000 times, and that is thanks to you. Every month, we receive messages from listeners telling us how big an impact hearing other people tell their stories has had on their lives. Please consider buying us a cup of coffee by clicking the link in the show notes. You can make a one-time or recurring donation of any amount you choose. Your donation helps us pay for hosting and for advertising to reach more people with a message of hope. Thank you for all your support. This community is truly amazing. This podcast is hosted by Dick Guyver, edited by Open Roads, and promoted by Turkish Restorer. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe and share it with your friends. We also need your help to keep this podcast going. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us pay for the podcast hosting and inspire others in their foreskin restoration journeys.